What's good? It's Woog. Wow, they announced Terence Crawford versus Shawn Porter. This is taking place November 20th in Las Vegas, Nevada, and it's going to be shown through ESPN pay-per-view. So they basically worked this out contractually at the last moment before this fight went to purse bid, where anybody could have put up some money to try to control the rights to the fight. But I am ecstatic that this fight was finally made. They'd been teasing it. The WBO is the one that triggered this and ordered the fight because Terence Crawford is the WBO Welterweight champ. Shawn Porter is the #1 contender, the mandatory. So WBO basically said, no, this has to take place. And so since we aren't getting Terence Crawford versus Errol Spence, seemingly anytime in the near future, we thought we were just going to get Errol Spence versus Manny Pacquiao, but then Errol Spence turned out he had a torn retina in his eye. Ugas stepped in for Errol Spence, beat Pacquiao via decision, retained his WBA belt, that's Ugas. So on that side of things, on the PBC side of things, we kind of expect that Errol Spence might take on Ugas next, depending on when Errol Spence returns and just how, the promoters and sanctioning bodies end up playing this one out. But we at least know that Terence Crawford has a foot in the door to the PBC stable. Shawn Porter's a PBC fighter. So this has pretty much been a case of Terence Crawford being on the outside looking in for the duration of his welterweight experience thus far. He's now 5-0 as a welterweight, with all 5 of those welterweight fights ending via knockout or TKO. Whereas when he was fighting, say, lightweight, 135, he beat Ricky Burns for the title via decision. He beat Breedis Prescott a few fights before that via decision. Then, obviously, he went to 140 and unified all 4 major belts. His most significant win out of that bunch, by the way, I would say is Victor Postal. Victor Postal might actually be his most significant win to date, including his run at 147. You had basically a prime, undefeated Victor Postal who recently stopped Lucas Matisse and was kind of flirting with people's top 10s, pound for pound. And Terence Crawford beat Victor Postal via unanimous decision. Dropped him twice in that fight as well. So since turning welterweight, he's fought and stopped Jeff Horn, Jose Benavidez Jr., that's the older brother, but smaller brother of David Benavidez, up at 168. Then he being Crawford, took on Amir Khan, Mean Machine Kavaliauskas, Kell Brook. Again, all 5 of those fights ended in stoppage. Outstanding track record at welterweight. But the problem is that all of the top 10, or most of the top 10 guys, have been on the PBC side. And it's kind of become like an impenetrable wall where, the cross promotions at 147, it just hasn't been taking place. Now, you've had a couple sort of free agent-ish fighters like Manny Pacquiao, Mikey Garcia, who've been able to go and fight 1 or 2 fights at PBC kind of on a case-by-case basis, but they just haven't been letting Terence Crawford in the door. And, Bob Arum hasn't been putting up the huge money that would be required to make a Terence Crawford versus, you name it, on the PBC side fight come together where all parties are satisfied. But in this case, they worked it out, but Shawn Porter's not going to be fighting on Showtime or Fox or one of their pay-per-views. He's actually going to be fighting at or on ESPN pay-per-view. And look, I get it. The public really thinks that Terence Crawford is just in another league and is going to outclass Shawn Porter. I've heard a lot of people say that they think Terence Crawford's going to stop Shawn Porter. Shawn Porter is about as durable, a 147-pound fighter as they come. He's never been stopped in his career. He's lost 3 times via decision to Kell Brook, Keith Thurman, and Errol Spence Jr., all close fights. The Kell Brook one I thought was more decisive than the Keith Thurman and the Errol Spence Jr. one. The Errol Spence Jr. one was so close and even in my book that Errol Spence Jr.'s knockdown of Shawn Porter late in that fight is what had me kind of tip the scale in favor, or tip the cards in favor of Errol Spence Jr. Super close fight. And so I'm asking those who think Terence Crawford is going to run away with this one and is going to show that he's in another league, How is he going to do it? Is he going to hit Porter with like an off-time counter? They say that he's ambidextrous, right? That he's equally good lefty, southpaw. I actually think he's a lot better and more devastating on the southpaw side. I don't think he's an A-plus defender from either stance. I don't, he gets hit sometimes when he doesn't need to, sometimes because he's over engaging and just opening himself up, and other times when the guy's just getting through and landing a shot that they wanted to land. So he's not Pernell Whitaker, Floyd Mayweather when it comes to the defense. I just don't see it, but he's a lot more aggressive and just hell-bent on hurting the opponent than most fighters, especially when he gets hit early in the fight. Just look at his fight and knockout win over Yorkis Gamboa, or even much more recently against Mean Machine Kavaliauskas. When he's in trouble, he kind of has this like devious glare in his eyes, smiles, and basically says, "I am effort," and then comes at you. But, what I see him do is start off from a conventional stance, with the left hand being the jab hand and the right hand being the power hand. And then he fights a couple even fights against his opponent. They say that he's, downloading, collecting data. That's usually what they would say about a Floyd Mayweather, about a Vasily Lomachenko. But what I see is a pretty even fight, and then he switches stances to southpaw, and now he's hitting the opponent with punches from angles and distances that they just weren't seeing from this stance. So, for instance, when he just fought Kell Brook, I thought Kell Brook might have been winning 2 out of the 3 first, a couple of the first early rounds. This ended up being a TKO stoppage in the 4th, but in the 3rd round is when Terence Crawford switched to southpaw. Continued to get, hit a bit. I thought Kell Brook had the quicker hands. I actually thought this was going to be a very, competitive fight, and it was for a couple rounds. But then Terence Crawford hit Kell Brook with this weird lead left hand that looked like it hit around the side of the head orbital area, and Kell Brook was just all out of sorts, off balance. He went crashing into the ropes and wasn't really defending himself intelligently beyond that point, besides just covering up and looking wobbly. They stopped the fight. I was confused as hell. I didn't see the power behind the punch, but it might have been the off timing of when Crawford threw the punch, plus, Kell Brook kind of stepping into it and not seeing the punch. They say that it's the one you don't see that really hurts you, right? So if that's the case, and if that's what you think Crawford's going to hit Porter with to get him out of there, maybe. But when have we seen Porter in deep trouble? And again, Porter is as durable, and he's a survivor when he needs to be, but he's basically in your chest for 12 rounds, and he's moving his head the whole time. He's got unreal endurance. Like, how is this guy able to keep a relatively low crouch while moving his head and having the leg and the athleticism to jump in and out of the pocket and throw combinations? No, he's not throwing the most crisp punches, and he's not the most accurate puncher. Many believe that he smothers his punches and that he's not getting the full juice out of the squeeze on what looks like it should be a lot of power, kind of maybe misjudging it based on the build, his physical build. You can't make too much of that. Sometimes the guys who don't look like they are, physically outliers when it comes to their physique have the hardest punches. But Shawn Porter, if nothing else, has a motor. 12 rounds. If he could have fought back in the 15-round days and been able to give it a good go throughout the duration of the fight. What I'm saying is, 1, is Shawn Porter chinny to you? I know he got dropped in the 12th round against Adrian Broner in a fight that he won. I know that he got decked by Errol Spence late in their fight. Still recovered, came back, and finished the fight. Super close scorecard. This thing was a split decision win for Errol Spence Jr. But I'm asking you, what is Terence Crawford going to do that will disable Shawn Porter from being able to fight him even rounds, basically? That's the kind of... You're either losing the round against Shawn Porter, unless you're Paulie Malignaggi. That's about as devastating as I've ever seen Shawn Porter look. This was just on the heels of Shawn Porter winning his first major belt, the IBF title, against Devin Alexander, which that was Shawn Porter's big breakout party. His next fight was against a long-in-the-tooth Paulie Malignaggi, but he just smoked Malignaggi. He was looking like the second coming to Mike Tyson in that fight. Go back and watch Porter versus Paulie Malignaggi. I thought, oh my God, this guy's unreal. But that ended up being the exception, not the rule, in terms of the punching power of Shawn Porter. He wins the vast majority of his fights via unanimous decision or, just some decision. In fact, out of the 10 fights that Porter's had since stopping Malignaggi, he only has 2 stoppages, 2 knockouts, and one of the guys you probably haven't heard of, Eric Bone or Bonet. And the other one was against Andre Berto. They didn't need to stop that fight, but there were so many headbutts and cuts in the fight. It was a super rugged fight. Porter made it all kinds of uncomfortable for Andre Berto, who likes to kind of have some distance and work his, speedy punches, which Shawn Porter just doesn't give you the luxury of being able to kind of sit around and, gauge distance. Like, you really have to be moving around to keep Shawn Porter off of you. Again, I think that the best to do that so far has been Kell Brook. But again, if Keith Thurman wasn't able to keep Shawn Porter off his ass, you think Terence Crawford is that much better than prime Keith Thurman, who at one point was looking like either the best or second best welterweight in the, we'll call it the post-Floyd Mayweather era? Which, by the way, I never thought that Manny Pacquiao was going to fight any of the current welterweight kings. I didn't think he was going to fight prime Kell Brook or prime Keith Thurman or, prime Errol Spence. Turns out, Manny Pacquiao has proven to want all the smoke. So, oh my goodness. Even though I did think at first, before they announced Pacquiao versus Spence, I thought that it might have been Pacquiao versus Crawford, which I would have picked Crawford to stop Pacquiao. That was where I was going. If they did Spence versus Pacquiao, I was leaning Errol Spence via decision. But, Shawn Porter has shown that he can switch it up and box from the outside a bit. He did so against Danny Garcia more than he normally does. He wasn't just continuously jumping into the pocket against Garcia. And maybe he shows some of that against Crawford, kind of, working behind a jab a little bit more. But I think it's more a case that Porter makes this uncomfortable for Terence Crawford and fights even rounds. But yeah, I'm just super glad that they've announced this fight. Let me know who you think is going to take this. I know most of y'all think that Terence Crawford, but tell me why. What is he going to do to keep Porter from basically fighting him evenly, where it's up to the judges at the end of the fight, like what style they preferred? I was saying this for a while, about the welterweight division and about the welterweight elites fighting each other. Basically, you've got a bunch of 115 to 113 scorecards. You know what I mean? These are all super, give and take. Porter versus Thurman was that. Thurman versus Danny Garcia was that. Porter versus Errol Spence Jr. was that. Did I already say Thurman versus Porter? Yeah, all of those are 115, 113-ish fights. Maybe 116, 112. But what is Crawford going to do to separate himself from all the other great fighters that Shawn Porter has already gone the distance with? Props to the fighters and for all parties involved in making this fight, scheduling this fight. Please no COVID, please no injuries. I want to see this fight take place. Right now, I'm actually kind of leaning Shawn Porter in a 115, 113-ish fight. But let me know what you think. Please leave your comments in the comments. By the way, I'm going to do a full preview in the days leading up to the fight, and I'm probably going to do a maybe a couple weeks or a month from now, somewhere kind of splitting the time between now and the fight to kind of give an update on the matter. But yeah, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.